Short. Okay, so please let's start first with presenting yourself, who you are, where you are now. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm Malcolm Parlett, and I'm in my home in Totnes in Devon, which is in England. So that's kind of one answer to who am I. But I'm conscious of that being like a Zen koan. It's like there's any number of answers.
Yeah. So if this, let's imagine I am a Zen master and asking you again, who are you, Malcolm?
Well, of course, there are 1,000 answers. I mean, at one level, I'm a kind of tiny, tiny, tiny little speck in the universe. So infinitesimally small. And a blob of protoplasm. But I'm also a citizen of the world and very much against Brexit. So I mean, there's, we just go on and on. I do think of myself as a kind of node, a live node in the whole human network, as we all are. I'm also somebody who loves Gestalt, which is probably why we're here at this moment.
Yeah, and
yes, I mean, I'm also a war child, because I was born in the Second World War, and so much of my life has been affected by that war. My first memories are of it and of my life in the period. And I don't know whether we'll come on to that, but I mean, it is like, I'm never forgetting that the devastation, the stupidity, the cruelty, everything that was around at that time, terrible devastation. And so I'm not a what's the word I'm after? I'm not somebody who just goes along on the sort of froth of life, having a good time. I am forever, in a sense, mindful of very, very big global issues. So that's, as I've been thinking about this, that's something I thought I would introduce and say more about if you want me to.
Yes, I mean, of course, later on with relation to Gestalt therapy, but maybe first of all with relation to our humanness, I imagine. It is not only...
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. I mean, I've been hugely inspired by Paul Goodman in particular, and he was a man of letters. I mean, he was literary, he was philosophical, he was political, he was an activist, he was, an experimenter in so many different ways, personally and politically and professionally. So, I mean, in some sense, I also have very broad interests and see myself very much as a human being, a wounded healer, but someone who struggles and to make sense of my existence and how to be, how to live. So I feel very, very much part of the human condition. I'm interested in it, and I think it's what we're all about in the Gestalt world.
And if you were to name some of your major qualities, values, you partly are already touching it, but
yes,
what would they be?
Well, it's difficult to know where to begin because I've been very much involved with developing new maps of Gestalt because I want to reach out. I think Gestalt is an extraordinary discipline, amazingly, an amazing gift to humanity, but it's always underplaying itself. It doesn't reach out and grab enough people. I think maybe more now in some ways, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. But I mean, in Britain, it's very difficult to, and in the States, you know, Gestalt is not flourishing in terms of numbers. And so I feel that there's a real danger that some of the magic and the power of this approach, the usefulness of this approach, could get lost, which has governed a lot of my work, including the writing of my book, which is called Future Sense, which was very much about trying to bring everything that I have learned and know about, teach, into a much wider constituency of interest. So in a sense, a lot of my values and ideas and so on are bound up with that book and the work that it's associated with. It's an interesting question. Say it again, so if I can take another.
Yeah. I mean, like now I wanted to say, okay, Malcolm, if I consider myself a bit as a friend of yours, and I could somehow enumerate some of your qualities that are now somehow familiar with me. But if you were to enumerate some of your qualities as Malcolm, who lives where he lives.
Well, I find this incredibly difficult because actually, I can't. Part of my, one of my qualities is that I am persistent and I keep looking, and I feel very committed to the exploration of my life, the autoethnography aspect, and to going to the roots, the absolute roots of who I am in terms of my characterological structure and so on. And I think in some ways Gestaltists haven't always done enough of that. You know, they stop at a certain point and everything else sort of goes into the basement and they don't go down there anymore. But I am absolutely determined to be, in a sense, working on exploring my roots and my being, my becoming, as my life path, and it will be, I want to be doing it right up to the moment I die. I had a friend, I don't know why this has just come to me, but I have a friend who was an experimental physicist at MIT, a wonderful man, and deeply curious about absolutely everything, and very inquisitive and always wanting to know and so on. And he was one of my mentors, if you like, and an inspiring figure to me when I was there. And when he died, his last words to his wife were, this is interesting. I think that is just so magical.
Wow. Yeah, it's difficult to ask you such, you know, questions like that narrow you down to this everyday life, if you like. But what are your yeah? Go on.
Well, I just my qualities. I'm in a sense what I'm told are my qualities are, that I'm fairly steady and calm and certainly stay with my friends as much as I can, and I'm available. I feel quite available and open, and I do enjoy talking to people and listening to people and discovering about their lives as well as being interested in my own. So it's I love, as I said, I love Gestalt, and I love its history in a sense. I'm very interested in the history of Gestalt and how it came into being and what's happened to it over the time. Got lots of things I could say about that.
Are you going to speak about that a bit later on, about this history you are interested in of Gestalt and of?
I could.
Okay.
I mean, I could talk about all sorts of things.
Okay, and what about, because what about other passions, if Gestalt maybe also call it this way? What do you like doing, Malcolm?
Oh, what do I like doing? I love food and eating and enjoy that a lot. I love being in the outside world and walking, often alone in the countryside, and I'm very lucky to be living here with great walks and so on nearby, and the river and the sea not so far away. I write a little poetry. I love listening to classical music, at least some composers.
Like?
Well, what I'm having a real feast on at the moment is Beethoven, because it's his 250th year, and the BBC is putting on a lot. So I listen to it absolutely as much as possible. But I've got a lot of Beethoven CDs and so on, and listening to the late quartets, I mean, it's just magic, absolute magic, and I can go on listening and listening and listening to them. I'm very much involved in keeping up with world affairs too, and our own national politics, which is dire. Not quite as dire as the US, but on the way. And I love to. I mean, in the lockdown, we don't do much of this, but I love dinner parties.
Okay. Oh.
Slightly bibulous conversations with wicked friends. It's not all serious in this house.
Yeah. This is as I imagined. But so you are still under the lockdown in the UK? Not so.
Well, we're coming out of it very slowly.
So no dinner parties yet, I guess.
No dinner parties yet. Okay, we recently I have had dinner over Zoom with some friends, which was quite amusing. We cooked and sat together and ate, and which was very nice. And I had drinks with some friends recently in the same kind of make believe.
Yeah.
It ain't the same, needless to say.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking of doing the same with my international friends in a month's time because of my birthday coming. So I wonder how it will look like.
Right.
What is it? They call it, techno-phenomenological distance.
Yes.
But
from my point of view, it's a fantastic example of field theory in action, as it were, because it's like a completely, it's a field that's been upturned, and yet we can find the things that are common and that sustain us, the familiarities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And even more connections, no more networks, I guess.
Yeah. Yes. Well,
I
I'm aware that we met on Zoom we were both in a meeting together,
yes.
having never met. So yes.
Yes, yes. So you think that it's, yeah, I wonder if this is going to be a durable phenomenon, this kind of intensity of networking now under COVID-19 circumstances.
Yes, it's very interesting. I suspect there'll be more anyway. I mean, and even before this,
Mm-hmm.
Headless Mexico conference was distance, and we have to do that. We can't fly around the world in vast numbers.
Yes.
Certainly, I can't because I've got a horrible carbon footprint already.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm deeply reluctant to fly now.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. Um, okay, and back to you as a human, still, who impacted you the most in your life? Who, what?
In the Gestalt world or in my life generally?
More generally.
Well, one of the things I said that I've gone back and back and back to look at the very beginnings of my life. And I was massively affected by the conditions in which I was born. Apart from the war going on, my mother, I have to tell you this, it's a sort of, but it is one of the defining things of my life, which is that my mother had an affair, and I was a product of her lover.
Mm-hmm.
And her. And then she kind of returned to her, ditched the lover, my father, and went back, even though I think she loved him very dearly. That's what I've learned slowly. Went back to her husband and pretended that I was her husband's son.
Mm-hmm.
And this was conditions of my beginning, that she was in intense confusion in the middle of a war, had a 3-year-old little boy, a husband who was in the RAF and who was not doing at all well psychologically, losing her lover and becoming pregnant. And I mean, so what happened really, I think, was that then she kind of reacted and poured a huge amount of attention onto me,
Mm-hmm.
maybe out of guilt in some ways, because she'd also been unable to breastfeed me.
Mm-hmm.
And our relationship became incredibly close, unhealthily close, so that therapists have described it as emotional abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And but I lived in her orbit. And what, of course, I realized is how much I've taken on of hers.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly, she was very anxious. I've been very anxious for a lot of my life. But she was also very, in a sense, plucky and experimental, and I've been those. But I think overall, and confused, she was hugely confused and very insecure. I think, and I've only very recently, in the last couple of years, learned this, that her grandmother, in other words, my great-grandmother, committed suicide, having been put into a mental asylum, considered crazy. And she came out and then committed suicide. And I'm sure that that hovered in the backgrounds of her mind. There was a lot of huge amount of fear. I was marinated in fear, not, enhanced by the fact that, we were going into air raid shelters and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the beginning. And so I say I've been massively influenced by her. But then, and then I didn't discover the truth of my birth until I was 50 years old.
Oh.
He only told me when her husband died. They kept up a kind of collusive, non-talking about it. I'm sure he knew. I'm absolutely sure he knew. But he wasn't going to rock any boats. So I went along with it. We were never close, he and I. He was much closer to his actual son, who was my half-brother, who I thought was my full brother for 50 years. Anyway, so when I discovered the truth, then shortly after that, I began to search for my actual father, my biological father. And so I think he's also influenced me. I think that I think he influenced me genetically and epigenetically. I think he was, I've always been very interested in food and in alternative views of food and so on. He was a lifelong vegetarian, ran health food stores. He was a green before his time, somebody described him as. Very lively guy, very interesting. And he was a conscientious objector in the First World War. He was imprisoned. So prison has been a kind of, I've never been to prison, but I've visited prisons and, or a prison. And I kind of feel in some ways that I was imprisoned myself in my very early life. So it's been a big, you can understand why I'm so keen on Goodman, who talks about the freedom and advocating taking on the world and turning it into something which is humane, personal. But yes, so my journey since I was 50 and now I'm nearly getting on towards 80, the best part of 30 years, it has been about really assimilating this extraordinary identity shift. So I notice that I don't really like the fact that I'm called Parlett anymore. But on the other hand, and I did think about changing my name, but my actual father's name was Smith, which is extremely common in this country. And it seemed, it's really, really more interesting name. That would have been a bit more of an encouragement to change my name. But I didn't really want to do that because in a sense, the man who brought me up, who I don't think of as my father now, he was mild-mannered man in many ways, but he gave me quite a lot in many ways. He was both my parents were extremely hard workers, and I'd been a compulsive workaholic, really, doing amazing, much too much, trying to do too much. So, but I mean, obviously, I had a friend of mine, an analyst in the States, whose definition of a human being was a mother and a father wrapped up in a single skin. And I think there is something in that. I mean, it's just, I don't think we sometimes in Gestalt have paid enough attention to really researching the nature of our parents. I mean, some therapists have, but I think that a lot it's been more because it's so much in the past, and we've emphasized incredibly much and stood for the starting from the present. and sort of, if necessary, going back, but not focusing.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I'm so excited by the Adam Kinsell's book, which I've just written a foreword for, on autoethnography, because he's done what I have been doing too and want to do more of, which is writing about his life, but as a researcher, taking it seriously. How did I get affected by my beginnings?
Mm.
And how am I a cultural artifact? I mean, that's the other thing. And I am, if you said, who am I? I mean, one of the other many answers I could give is that I'm an incredibly privileged, unbelievably privileged member of the human race. First of all, I'm a white male, and I've lived through a period of at least in Britain, relative tranquility. And in the course of my lifetime, it coincides with a huge, steep increase in the amount of carbon that's been emitted. So that it's like we lived in this unbelievable luxury in terms of human life in its entirety and as it's always been. So I feel incredibly privileged. And it's, it's a very big question for me about all the fact that so many people aren't so privileged. At the moment we're into the Black Lives Matter raised consciousness, but there are so many other constituencies as well who have been lost or not nourished really by the world. And I think I've always been wanting to bring out some, like in the St. Francis prayer, like bring out of darkness, find the light, raise the spirits of the depressed and the dismal, and to bring laughter where there is just sadness and so on. It's like I think there's a bit of that in me, of wanting to redress the not so good features in other people's lives, as well as in my own. I mean, it's projective as well.
Yeah, could you say more about this feature of yours with this two sides of the coin? Is it do I understand it right? Like two sides of one coin. Can we call it this way? Because you were very, I mean, you did such a shortcut. I mean, I understood the introduction, but then, you've summarized.
I'm not sure I know what you're referring to. Are you talking about the fact that I'm both looking back, but also I'm very committed to things in the present? I mean,
this is one thing, but the last thing you were referring to this being, to people being privileged, overprivileged maybe, and underprivileged, and this being also in one person, as I understand you.
Yes. Well, I'm thinking that in historic terms, I've lived in a golden period.
Okay.
And it can't go on, because we can't keep on consuming
Mm-hmm.
the earth resources. We're into a completely, my children and my grandchildren and whatever will inevitably have a tougher time. And so I do feel, in some sense, a generational kind of guilt about the fact that it is my generation. I mean, I don't want to carry the guilt for everybody, but it's like I don't want to shrug it off either. We didn't stop our wanting luxury items and going on flights and, you know, flying hither and thither and so on. And even when there was plenty of evidence that we were going to go into, we were building up to a crisis. In fact, I remember I used to more or less commute across the Atlantic for almost the 1970s. I was many times a year going back and forth. And I remember once getting on a plane and there were only 3 passengers. Now, of course, nowadays the plane wouldn't go, but in those days they did. And the pilot talked about the amount of air fuel, gasoline or whatever it is, that was used in the takeoff, just the takeoff of this plane. And it was shaking, and that was back in the 70s. So, I mean, why didn't I go and train myself to the railings or something? You know, I mean, that's sort of, I mean, I don't want to punish myself over much, but it is something that worries me.
Mm-hmm. But then when it is somehow put it, but you first spoke about the war period and those war circumstances, and then that it was as if balancing, no, rebalancing, getting some balance again.
Yeah. Well, in some sense, that's true. Yes. After the war, things improved a lot.
Mm.
And I was very frightened and little boy, but when I got to a good school and I was well educated, another privilege, that I was very scared and very small physically at the time. But then I kind of had a major recovery while I was at school and became got the Sportsman of the Year award and the writing prize and was a captain of this and a captain of that. So it was like I had a kind of what it felt like a rags to riches process as I went through my school days. And that was very transformative.
Oh, okay. And yeah. Well, anyway, it is interesting for your generation and the generation that is a bit younger, but it is nevertheless more or less the same tendency, no? Those depressive period of the war, and then this maniac.
Yes, because of course the war actually lasted, culturally speaking, way past the actual end of fighting. I mean, it was talked about endlessly, and we walked around bomb sites, and you know, it was just everywhere. It didn't go away until, in a sense, until well into the late 50s, early 60s.
Okay, but let's again many paths and many ideas, but let's go on with with some order here, because I have also questions about how did you actually come to Gestalt?
Well, I'll tell you that. It's what happened to me was that I studied psychology at university. I went at Nottingham University. I got a first. I went to Cambridge, did a PhD. But what I realized, and I was an experimental psychologist, I didn't like experimental psychology, and I was not very good at it. And I thought it was suspect, deeply suspect as an activity. It was like trying to be scientific, but with some very funny assumptions. And I just was not made out for it. So I then had a very lucky break that I was able to go to America, to MIT, to work with a couple of psychiatrists who worked with students in the Student Health Service. And that began my work. My first major career was as an educational program evaluator and consultant. And I did that for about 10 years, mostly through the 70s. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I was doing was I was working, I had my own little consulting group, and I went to a consortium of liberal arts colleges, had a summer school for teachers for college teachers. Mm-hmm. So I went to that, and they had a Gestalt workshop for 3 days. It was a very odd thing to have amid all the sort of rather boring educational things that were on. Mm-hmm. But of course, I went to it thinking I was a consultant. I wasn't taking part in the program. I was supposed to be helping the organizers to run it better and so on. And so I went, and I thought I'd sit at the back. Well, I didn't just sit at the back. I was involved, and it was run by an amazing woman called Caroline Luckensmeyer, who went on to be, she was an organizational consultant, and she went on to be eventually working in the Clinton White House. Mm-hmm. She was a high flyer, and she carried on doing very big things. But anyway, but she was amazing. She was so bright, a little bit younger than me, if anything, at that time, I think, but immensely further on in life than I was. And I fell in love with Gestalt and a little bit with her, but very much with Gestalt. And she said, you must come and train, come and do a training at Cleveland, mm-hmm. where she was on the faculty. Mm-hmm. So that's what I did. And so that was my beginning. And I was so lucky to have been at the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland at that time. It was the golden period. It was an amazing period. The pollsters had been there, but they had left for California. But in a sense, the people who were running it at that time were people like Sonia Nevis, mm-hmm. Ed Nevis, a man called Bill Warner, who was a very big influence for me. Elaine Kepner, Jim Kepner's mum.
Okay.
Has had a lovely connection with her, and a woman called Renette Fantz, who I noticed. I did watch Michael Clemens' interview, mm-hmm. and he was very close to Renette Fantz, and I was so pleased to hear him talking about her, because she was an amazing woman. But they were all amazing, and that was one of the things which I really loved about Gestalt, was that all these people, they were also different, in different characters and things. There was no kind of doctrinaire line. They were all unique in the way they did things. So I couldn't interject any of them really, because they were so different. And I'm very pleased about that. It was very healthy. It was a marvelous time. And completely transformative for me, and set me on a completely different life path, mm-hmm. which I'm still on.
Mhm. It was like back in the 80s, beginning of the 80s, or end of the 70s.
End of the 70s. 70, my very first experience was in 1975.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
That was with Carolyn.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I trained in 77, 8,
Okay.
that sort of time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Uh, yeah, I imagine you can go on with
I could.
chronologically, but also I have this specific question about uh, your attraction to maybe a list of attractions. I don't know, to Gestalt theory and practice. What were you the most attracted by?
Well, I think I obviously asked myself this question a lot, but I think that what attracted me was the truth telling,
Mhm.
that people were telling their truth of what their experience was. I
Mhm.
had not had that. I had been first of all lied to for all my life. And
Mhm.
of course, I still didn't know the truth of my life at that time.
Oh, yeah.
So and you know, one lie leads to others and leads to not going down to the real what's really going on here. You know, so I hadn't had that in my family, but in a sense, my schooling was, you
Mhm.
know, I was an English public school boy, and that's not real either. And so I hadn't really encountered. And then, you know, the academic world is well, you're an academic, you know that that you present a face. You
Oh.
don't really say what's happening for you. And there were all these people, and they were talking about what was their feelings and their insecurities or whatever. And I just thought it was miraculous
Mhm.
and completely different.
Mhm.
So that was the main thing. But I think the other thing that um, uh, I didn't get really into field theory at that moment.
Mhm.
That came a bit later, and I came back to England. Um, no longer I was not trying to work in two continents. I came back and began a lot of Gestalt ventures. There was a little bit of Gestalt going on,
Mhm.
but I started up various things, including the Gestalt Psychotherapy and Training Institute,
Mhm.
which, although I was billed as a co-founder, I was basically doing all the work and holding it. Really, it wouldn't have existed, wouldn't have survived if it hadn't been for me. And I was also became the first editor of the British Gestalt Journal, which I did for 15 years. But along the way, we also started Gestalt conferences. So I organized the first two of those. And then the third or the fourth conference, I didn't organize any after that. Ken Evans,
Mhm.
who was a very kind of active guy, said he invited me to come to it and to deliver a lecture on field theory. And I'd read about field theory, but I'd read lots of things in Gestalt, and so I kind of gulped and said yes, I would. So I had 6 months
Mhm.
of deep immersion in field theory.
Mhm.
Read absolutely everything I could lay my hands on. Read Lewin, read Yontef, and another guy, his name Ratner.
Mhm.
They had written about it,
Mhm.
um, and so then I went and did the lecture, which I was, as always, revising it right up to the moment I went on the podium, and that's basically, that lecture is my 1991 paper, which has been quite widely read.
Yes.
So that was my beginning. And once I got the bug of writing about field theory, it sort of stayed with me, like a permanent interest. But of course, partly, I think what it was that I actually had been very field sensitive, because at some level, when I was told the truth of my upbringing, the first reaction I had was, oh, right, that makes sense, because I picked up so much in the field that hadn't been expressed cleanly and cogently. But at some level, I had intimations and feelings and whatever. So I think that I became deeply interested in contexts and the fields, the phenomenological fields that people have, and the fact that people have such different readings of the same experience, supposedly the same experience, which is a hugely important principle that I don't think we pay enough attention to. I mean, that you can take anything and ask people what their experience of it is. You know, you can show them a picture of something, and the incredible divergences between people about how each of us creates the constructivist view of perception, really. It's mind-boggling.
Do you think that we, like within Gestalt world, we highlighted enough, or not? In fact, because we somehow highlight this focus on differences. Well, I wonder, and on uniqueness of.
Yes. I mean, it is there, definitely part of what we teach and practice. But it's I don't know whether we're going to. Yes, I don't think we're going to cover much of the territory here, because we've been going for. There's so much to say. But I mean, I have been involved in these 5. They started off as 5 abilities of what I saw as being what Gestalt people learn. And I do want to say that that I've always been disappointed that we don't talk about Gestalt education. We talk about Gestalt therapy, and we talk about Gestalt training. We train people, we have training, you know, but we don't talk about Gestalt education, and yet I think that's what actually we're involved in. It's learning, and education is different from training, because training, you learn specific things like that. But education is you build on what your own experience, and you find your way around. And it really confirms Laura Pearls's view of that everybody builds on their own life experience, and in a sense does a different version of Gestalt therapy, because that's open to abuse, and that's another argument that we actually do need some common criteria. And that's happened. But I think that emphasis on our variety of ways of coming to Gestalt is one of its great strengths. Anyway, yes, and
that's this is exactly somehow responding my question, because I didn't know how to ask it. I intuitively feel that there is some risk also of ideologizing. I don't know how to put it, of making Gestalt principles ideology. I mean, if if it is not education, this kind of distinction that you've made between training and learning, it's yeah, it's like between culture, socializing, I don't know, being brought up by culture, yeah, and introjecting during trainings, I don't know, and I guess yeah, and there is this risk, and yeah.
Well, yes, I mean, partly why I've gone towards studying these changes that people go through when they're studying, and which led me into the 5 abilities, which then became 5 explorations, and in my book, because they're more than abilities. Abilities is a sort of funny word, really. It's got highly individualistic connotations. These are explorations or gateways into looking at the totality of what we do and how we live. And one of them is responding to the situation, which is very much the field theory emphasis. It's like the situational, the situational parameters, how we meet the context we're in. And part of that is that the way we see it, the way we perceive it, and how do we resonate to that? And how can we draw on our own capacities for agency and responsivity to those conditions that we're encountering? It's going right to the very center of what each person has to do. And then the others, I'm not sure whether we're going to go through all of them, but because they are well written up now and they're in a book and so on. But I have found them to be enormously important and useful to me. And as a map, it's a different kind of map of what we do in Gestalt. It's much more practice oriented. And it doesn't deny or go against any of the existing theoretical corpus of ideas, which are profound and good.
Yes. Yeah, I guess now I got a sense of those senses. I mean, the very motivation behind this for for exploring those senses. Yeah. Okay, I know. People may find this in your book, and we may still somehow get maybe to this point of because you said also about your interest in history of Gestalt. Yes.
Yes, I'm interested in that.
And I'm interested in your interest. Yeah, you mentioned that. Was it some kind of again some of your involvement in this, some specific interest, or how would you?
It's something that I am interested in it. I'm not. There are people who've gone into it more fundamentally than I have, and in much more detail. But I am conscious of the way that I sometimes lay out how people studying with me or I'm working with, how they are great somethings of Freud, because Pearls was, not a direct pupil, but he was a patient of Aaron Horney and other people who had been with the great man, the originator, and then I was taught by people who had been taught by Pearls. So it was like there are not so many generations, and it's like people are interested. They're interested in that. But I think that the other thing which is noteworthy is, again, the conditions in Germany at the time when the Pearlses Laura and Fritz were there, and the conditions in which they found themselves. And also, which I've also written about, Fritz's involvement in the First War. He was at the front line of one of the biggest areas of conflict for 9 months in medical officer category. And he must have seen unbelievable carnage. And so I think he was a profoundly traumatized man. Well, he was when he came out. And I've written about how I think that Gestalt, as he was kind of getting over his trauma, coming to terms with what he's done and seen and so forth, that those were where a lot of the original Gestalt priorities started to form as reactions against a war mentality. So, so many of our concepts, like, well, take projection. I mean, war brings out the most malevolent, malicious projections possible. The other side are all bad. We don't do anything wrong. It was like always somebody else.
Yes.
And so bad that we would try and get rid of them. I mean, it's like crude psychology in war. And I think that was deeply formative. And so I've written about the fact that I think we are a peace education. It's the first peace education.
And so if these origins go back to the wartime and to this trauma of the 20th century, then what's the future of Gestalt world? Gestalt therapy. I wonder if it is, for my generation, for younger generation. Are we to follow the rules that were constructed then?
We're in a different, you're in a completely different world now.
Yes.
And yet there are incredible dangers, just as there were back then, but they're just different dangers. And I think that we have to cultivate and encourage and greater empowerment. And in a way, that in the way that Goodman really showed, we are all dissidents. And we need to be, to find ways in which collectively we can make an impact. And I think that reaching out in so many ways, but we have to be inventive about that. I've written about being a citizen practitioners, which is something which I think is hugely significant, because there are so many ways in which, as we go around at political meetings or community activities, there's so many ways in which actually we have expertise and insights that come directly from our Gestalt understanding and our Gestalt practice that are applicable and we can find ways to gently introduce them and help people, help meetings to take place. So every organization, every international negotiation, there are meetings, and we know a lot about meetings. We know about the importance of completing gestalts. We know about the fact that if people suddenly go silent and withdrawn or whatever, that there may be something going on for them which is inhibiting them from coming out with their useful creative contribution. So there are ways in which we might be able to do something about that. There are ways in which we can change language from pompous managerial business speak into things that are real and which enliven people. So there's this enlivening process that I think that Goodman was so on about, and which we need to be his heirs to.
Yeah, so in other words, there are some historic contingencies and some universal aspects that are constitutive for Gestalt therapy, no? In some ways. I mean, universal, like those features that you are, features or senses or explorations.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, I do see those. I do see those as potentially universal, because they relate to key human functions, relating together, being cognizant of our own process, learning about our own process, attending to ourselves, being aware, being embodied. Breaking down the idea that somehow if we think something, that's the only way we can address it. The bringing out of the world of feeling and attending to our heart's desire and gut sense. It's part of being a whole intelligent person, or a whole intelligent process. Experimenting, responding to the situation. So like the 5 are enormously rich seams that I keep on mining, and I keep on finding more and more in them.
And I from this conversation, which is about to be ending, I guess, even though yeah, I don't want to, but from this conversation, I am now even more inclined to highlight this again, this distinction between education and training, and educating young trainees rather than only training them, because otherwise, I guess the process we may observe is the other way around. Not like that we, with our Gestalt exploration, are colonizing in a good sense the world, but the world is colonizing our explorations, you know, like with this yeah, I mean, like a number of Gestalt institutes, being people being trained, it's good, but at the same time it risks of massive kind of massive popularization, which sometimes is really reduction, you know, simplify.
Yes, I mean, part of what we have is a vehicle, an amazing vehicle for tackling complexity at many different levels. And to deal with complexity, we need diversity of points of view, we need empowerment, we need direction, you know, and for people to follow their interests and build on their personal interests and qualities, vocations, as Goodman talks about it over and over. So yes, it's. I mean, well, we could go on for a long time, couldn't we?
Yeah.
Anyway, I hope this is okay.
Yeah, this is. So thank you very much, Malcolm, for this interview.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for asking me.